At 4:20 a.m., over Rostov-on-Don, Rostov Oblast, southern Russia, deep inside Russian territory, the sky suddenly became an invisible runway. A formation of 68 Ukrainian UAVs was charging straight toward its target at 290 miles per hour. And in less than 59 seconds, the strike would crash down on what Ukraine considers a critical link in Russia's combat capability, the Atlant Aero UAV production plant. Ukraine assesses this as one of Russia's most important military facilities, a site running production lines capable of turning out hundreds of attack drones every single day. What makes it even more striking is that just a few days earlier, Moscow had publicly praised its newest achievement, the Geran-5 drone, and then immediately used it to launch waves of attacks directly against energy infrastructure, power grids, heating systems, and more, across major Ukrainian cities like Kyiv, Zaporizhia, Odessa, and Kharkiv. The result was widespread blackouts and major disruptions to heating systems in the middle of negative 10 degrees Celsius weather. But Russia didn't realize that this very chain of showy actions had unintentionally marked Atlant Aero as one of Ukraine's top priority targets, a place where, in a single moment, an entire drone production line running at full capacity could be turned into a field of scrap beneath a towering inferno. The Russians had always believed they were operating deep inside their own territory, and deeper still, inside a nearly impenetrable, multi-layered air defense fortress. At the top layer sat the S-400 systems, built to intercept aircraft and cruise missiles. Below that were Pantsir S-1 units, positioned to sweep clean drones and any low-flying targets. And the system they were proudest of was the POL 2-1 Electronic Warfare Network, a GPS, GLONASS jamming grid designed to make satellite-guided drones lose their bearings long before they could get close. On paper, it looked like a formidable, multi-tiered defensive wall, strong enough to challenge almost any kind of aerial strike. Russia was so confident that after unveiling the Geran-5 and repeatedly posting videos flaunting its results, some commanders in the area even popped champagne to celebrate. But war follows a cold rule. The moment you fall asleep on victory, danger moves in closest. What they didn't know is that over the past month, Ukrainian intelligence had been quietly tracking every rhythm of this defensive system. They studied it, dissected more than 1,000 hours of satellite imagery, and stitched together tiny details, all to find a single gap. And sometimes, one gap is all it takes to collapse an entire airtight network that only looks perfect from the outside. In the end, the fatal weakness wasn't a piece of hardware at all. It was the simplest thing: human beings. The pre-dawn duty crew at the Rostov-on-Don battery lacked experience and had developed a dangerous habit, routinely ignoring small radar returns flying low and blended into the snowfall, assuming they were just migrating birds. A small mistake, repeated long enough, stops being just a mistake. It becomes a door left slightly open precisely when the enemy needs it most to deliver the real strike. This plan was both daring and so exquisitely intricate that if it slipped even a single beat, the entire formation could be erased from the very first minute. Ukraine chose the exact pre-dawn window in midwinter when snow lay heavy, the wind howled, and visibility was choked by a freezing white veil. They drove the swarm in low to the ground to reduce radar return, even disguising their movement to resemble birds, merging into the messy, wind-tossed streaks of motion across snow and sky. In those conditions, radar has a harder time locking a target, and the human eye struggles even more. But the trade-off was terrifying. One small error in altitude, formation, or timing, and everything would be exposed. The risk was immense, but the payoff matched it, and Ukraine understood this was the kind of wager they had to make. If successful, the strike could cripple up to 80% of Russia's UAV output, and more importantly, cut off most of the Geran-5 stream Moscow had only just proudly unveiled days earlier. That wouldn't merely destroy a factory, it could break the operational tempo of Russia's air strategy for months. When Ukraine couldn't win against Russia's drone waves in the sky through sheer quantity, they chose to strike the route where the drones are born. But if it failed, the cost wouldn't end with a swarm of UAVs worth roughly $3.5 million vanishing into nothing. Failure would also mean Ukraine losing a rare window of opportunity. And once Russia recognized the direction of the attack, They would know exactly where to reinforce, making a perfect chance like this one unlikely to return for a long time. And just as the plan was completed, Ukrainian intelligence received an update that made the equation even harder. Russia had reinforced the area with a new 96 L6E mobile radar. This is the kind of radar that can detect and track up to 100 targets at once, with a range of up to 300 kilometers, able to identify low-flying targets like UAVs and cruise missiles, as well as high-altitude ones. It uses AESA phased array technology and serves as a primary sensor for S-300 PMU-2 and S-400 air defense systems. The radar can operate independently or as part of a network, continuously feeding precise targeting data to fire control units, and it was being run by an experienced crew with an order as simple as it was cold: shoot down anything that moves. So the question facing Ukraine now was this: how do you punch through a steel fortress like that when Russia has already seen the gap and immediately patched it with a new eye, sharper, farther reaching, and far less forgiving? At 4 a.m., roughly 80 miles from the border, inside a cramped UAV control room, Ukrainian operators began activating the operation. Cold light from FPV screens washed over their faces, each person moving in sync like a machine already programmed for this exact sequence. In their headsets, the orders came short and rapid fire. Formation ready. Move, move, move. The spearhead didn't open with a killing blow, it opened with deception. 18 British-made Banshee jet, 80-plus targets shot upward at 400 miles per hour, flying high and obvious, broadcasting an exaggerated radar signature big enough to make the enemy believe an entire squadron of Su-30 fighters was closing in. And as every eye and sensor snapped upward, the second layer slipped into place. 68 Ram-2 loitering suicide UAVs lifted off in the dawn, immediately dropped down to around 100 feet, hugged the terrain, and used the thick white snow cover over Rostov-on-Don as natural camouflage. But they didn't rush straight to the target. They waited for the exact moment the enemy took the bait, when the air defense network's reaction rhythm had already been pulled off beat by the decoys above. It was a familiar trick: make them look left while you strike from the right. Old, but when executed on tempo, with enough cold precision, it can force an entire defense system into the wrong response from the very first second. This intricate coordination was not the kind of operation where you launch on command and leave it to fate. The entire swarm was guided by a customized AI system called Bonds, blending autonomous optical navigation modules with the US-made AI toolkit. That meant even if GPS was cut or jammed, the drones could still continue on plan, identifying terrain on their own, correcting their flight paths, and choosing the right moment to dive into the target. In other words, Bonds turned drones that normally relied heavily on manual control into a smarter weapon system, and one far harder to neutralize. To maintain that level of precision, BONS continuously processed real-time data from a PD-2 reconnaissance UAV orbiting in an invisible circle at roughly 15,000 feet. Every variable was fed into the calculation, even a 20 miles per hour's crosswind. From there, the system automatically adjusted the flight path of each drone across the swarm, keeping the formation inside the correct corridor, on the correct rhythm, and, most importantly, on the correct timing. But no matter how sophisticated the AI was, the human element remained the final key. Ukrainian controllers weren't passengers watching numbers scroll across a screen. They were real pilots, always ready to seize manual control the moment anything drifted off script, because even a slight deviation could ruin the entire tempo of the strike. First-person perspective. The Ukrainian operator's eyes stayed locked on the radar signal. The air inside the control room was tight as a drawn wire, thick enough that everyone could feel the sound of their own breathing. One controller suddenly shouted, his hand clamping down on the stick as if restraining a beast about to break loose. The countdown ticked on, cold and indifferent. The swarm had only 6 minutes to cross the danger zone and reach the factory before Russia's seasoned crews could recognize what the real threat was and what was nothing more than ghost jets thrown out as bait. At 4:08 a.m., the trap began to work exactly as Ukraine had calculated. Inside Russia's command post, a seasoned commander saw precisely what the enemy wanted him to believe was real. On the central operations screen, a formation tagged as 28 MiG 3-5 fighters, was charging straight into the sector under his responsibility. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the radio and issued the order immediately, his voice sharp and decisive, a reflex forged through hundreds of alarms. Lock all targets, shoot them down. The Pantsir S-1 system switched into intercept mode at once. In less than 30 seconds, the launcher spat out missiles in rapid succession, tearing through the sky in blazing streaks of fire. Then, one by one, erasing 12 targets from the display in bursts of brilliant light. On radar, the bright points signaling a distant threat vanished so fast it felt like the defense was operating perfectly smooth. Procedural, textbook. Detect, lock, destroy, done. The crews moved in tight coordination, and the commander kept pressing orders, absolutely confident in his control and in the power of the layered air defense net. In that moment, he believed he was dealing with a clumsy air raid, a familiar drill from training, something that could be solved with fast reaction time and overwhelming firepower. But he had no idea that what had just been shot down wasn't the main blow at all. It was only the outer shell, the sacrifice already written into Ukraine's script. In Ukraine's command bunker, the soldiers remained calm as they watched each decoy icon blink out one by one. No one panicked, because this was the moment they had been waiting for. For them, the decoys weren't meant to survive. They were meant to draw fire, draw attention, and most importantly, pull the enemy's reaction away from the real target. And they succeeded. 30 seconds of valuable chaos had just been created, a golden window, long enough for the true strike swarm to slip forward in silence, perfectly on tempo. But the easy part was over. The Russian commander felt no excitement when he could smell blood. On the contrary, in that brief instant, he understood something far more unsettling. He was not the predator. He was being dragged straight into a real hunt. The moment the ghost jets vanished from the screen, he barked orders for the operators to sweep the entire frequency band, every altitude layer, leaving no gap unchecked. He was certain. Something was still out there, lurking beyond the edge of certainty. The element of surprise was gone, and the clock did not wait for anyone. Right now, the Ram-2 suicide UAV swarm had less than 5 minutes to reach the factory before a seasoned, hyper-vigilant crew could finally catch the scent of the true threat. By 4:15 a.m., the Russian commander erupted in fury. He realized he had been fooled cleanly, efficiently. The entire battle-hardened control team immediately began scouring the sky with everything they had: radar, visual watch, spectrum scanning, target tracing, stacking layers of data as if they could peel the truth out of the air itself. If they were exposed, the remaining 68 Ram-2s would be detected and destroyed long before they could close the distance. But the Bond's artificial intelligence had anticipated this scenario, and it didn't wait until it was cornered to react. It switched to a new tactic: Mirage. BOINT no longer tried to hide the drones. Instead, it turned them into something not worth suspecting, amid the dawn's natural clutter. Instantly, the formation split into 3 smaller groups, maneuvering in chaotic, conflicting directions like a painting torn into fragments, leaving tracking algorithms fumbling for a single coherent pattern. The flight control software, using biomimicry simulation data sourced from a disguised vessel in the Sea of Azov, began to replicate with precision the movement of large migratory bird flocks. On the main control board, where Russia's younger operators were straining to lock on to every signal, the icons of dangerous targets gradually dissolved into soft, simple traces, resembling ordinary returns, no longer shaped like a threat. At that exact moment, 15,000 feet above, the PD-2 quietly released a specialized infrared decoy. But it wasn't deployed to fool missiles the way people usually assume. The real target was something else entirely. It was meant to blind the enemy's ground-based optical cameras. The instant the decoy flared to life, the glare hit like a blade across the sky, and the snow did the rest. Thick snow cover immediately reflected and scattered the light in every direction, turning the entire space into a massive, unforgiving mirror. On the Russian operator's screens, the image suddenly collapsed into a whitewashed blur so bright it was almost impossible to tell where the target ended and the sky began, where the flight path was, and where the illusion took over. The irony was brutal. The white snow, once considered a natural advantage for Russia, had now become a weapon against them, using its own harsh reflectivity to sabotage their eyes. On the other side, inside Ukraine's UAV control bunker, an operator shot up and shouted, voice cutting through the noise. They're completely blinded. Push through this defensive point now. This wasn't recklessness, it was timing. They were exploiting a narrow window of chaos lasting only about 30 seconds. A brief lapse in effectiveness they had identified and measured in advance through surveillance. And as if everything had been set to a clock, that window opened at the exact moment of the shift change. 4:20 a.m., when human attention dips, routines reset, and a single blink can be enough for a formation to slip past the line between survival and disaster. In a single heartbeat, the effect worked exactly as planned. The young crew, still stunned, disoriented by the mirage that had just swept through, quickly reported back to command that the sky ahead was completely clear. No threats, no targets, nothing. But the veteran commander didn't even glance at the main tactical display. His eyes were locked onto the raw feed from the backup 96L6E radar system that had just been brought online. This was a sensor built to find a needle in a haystack, and in an instant, he spotted what didn't belong. Inside a cluster of signals that looked harmless, he could clearly see predators hiding among a flock of migrating birds. Anger surged through him. At exactly 4:25 a.m., the veteran commander decided he would not keep playing by the enemy's rules. Like a chess grandmaster, ignoring a bait sacrifice to stare straight at the checkmate just a few moves ahead, he boxed in those faint biological traces on the 96L6E and personally tagged them as the real threat. Immediately, the raw target data was pushed straight to the Pantsir S-1 launchers. The response was violent and almost instantaneous. 457E6 missiles tore out of their tubes, each accelerating to 3,600 feet per second. Their seekers rapidly locked onto the 18 drones that had been designated. But just as the Ukrainian operators prepared to execute their pre-programmed evasive maneuvers, an enemy no one had anticipated slammed down from the sky. A brutal snowstorm, with gusts hitting 35 miles an hour, ripped the formation apart. On the FPV feed, the horizon suddenly snapped sideways, then vanished into a blinding whiteout. The BON's artificial intelligence system tried to intervene at once, automatically correcting the flight path to compensate, but the hit came too fast, too hard. 6 drones failed to react in time and collided head-on. They didn't simply fall, they detonated, evaporating into 6 fireballs suspended in midair. On the operator's console, red warning lights strobed as icons disappeared one after another. And the worst part still hadn't ended. The 4 incoming missiles continued their lethal run. Now the Ukrainian strike force was forced to fight on 2 fronts at once against the cold steel power of Russia's air defense from above, and the raw, unpredictable violence of nature from below. Over the Russian command channel, the commander's voice cut through, threaded with triumphant laughter. They're out of tricks. And he wasn't wrong. Every pre-planned contingency had been burned through. With nearly half of the remaining strike force on the verge of being erased from the sky, the entire mission now hung swaying by a single fragile thread. 4:40 a.m. Only 4 missiles remained, plunging toward the ground with mere seconds to spare. On the tactical screens, everything seemed decided. The original plan had collapsed. The artificial intelligence system had exhausted every pre-programmed scenario, every evasive maneuver, every optimized algorithm, yet nothing had worked. In that suffocating moment, control no longer belonged to the machines. It returned to human hands. And the operators knew they had only one option left, a move both desperate and daring, borrowed directly from American military technology. Each Ram 2 loitering munition was not truly alone. Hidden behind it was a miniature electronic bodyguard, a scaled-down ALE-50 Decoy, a device originally designed to protect advanced fighter jets like the F-35 Lightning II. This was no ordinary flare that burns bright and fades in seconds. It was a genuine electronic trap. Once activated, it emitted radar and thermal signatures hundreds of times stronger than the UAV itself, an irresistibly easy target. Like a matador snapping open a massive red cape before a charging bull, it taunted, lured, and challenged the enemy's air defense system. The command was given. 4 decoys deployed simultaneously behind the targeted UAVs, dragging blazing signal trails across enemy radar screens. In an instant, 457E6 missiles already locked on to what seemed to be certain prey detected something far more tempting. Their guidance algorithms recalculated immediately. In less than a fraction of a second, the decision was made. They swerved sharply mid-air. 4 streaks of fire veered off course, chasing phantom targets flickering behind them. Seconds later, the sky ignited. 4 hollow fireballs erupted at an altitude of nearly 1,000 feet, harmless explosions in empty air. Ahead, the real UAVs held their course, silently cutting through the corridor that had just been opened. The opposing air defense system had expended its final volley on ghosts painted across the radar. On the Russian command channel, triumphant laughter abruptly died out, replaced by a heavy, stone-like silence and tightly compressed anger. He was no longer the hunter. Now, he was nothing but a spectator to a violent, relentless assault, one that could no longer be reversed. The moment the final threat was removed, the Ukrainian operators immediately issued the decisive command. The UAV swarm split into 4 clearly assigned strike elements. The first drove into the main assembly workshop, the second locked onto the parts warehouse, the third plunged straight into the central control building, and the last, largest and most critical, was tasked with hitting the drone storage depot that Russia had painstakingly built up over time to prepare for this war. And the Bond's artificial intelligence, in one final, brilliant act of opportunism, turned to 30-mile-per-hour winds, the very force that had nearly destroyed them, into a tailwind, pushing the remaining drones into a burst of speed for the finishing blow. Every layer of Russia's defenses had been breached. Every trick had been neutralized. The path to the factory now lay wide open. The final order from the Ukrainian operators was not a shout. It was a cold, quiet confirmation. Weapons ready. Begin the attack. The remaining 50 Ram-2 kamikaze drones had entered the final phase of the attack plan. They didn't simply charge straight in like disposable weapons. They operated like a disciplined pack of assassins. Each one was guided by an inertial navigation system, INS, combined with GPS, GNSS, holding an eerily stable flight path and continuing the mission even if the GPS signal was jammed or disappeared completely. Once they locked onto the target, the margin of error tightened to just about 3 feet. The first Ram-2, carrying a 15-pound anti-structure warhead, didn't just hit the roof of the main assembly hall. It punched through the roofing, then drove through a 6-inch layer of reinforced steel, and only then detonated directly above the core production line of the Atlant Aero UAV factory. Immediately after, one by one, the swarm kept hammering the components warehouse and the central control building. The strikes landed like a timed composition, precise, synchronized, and absolutely destructive. But the true genius of this raid wasn't only in hitting the targets, it was in how the explosions were engineered. Each warhead's fuse was set with an exact 8-second delay. That tiny interval was vital because it was designed to maximize the pressure wave inside enclosed spaces. The difference was like an explosion in open air versus one occurring inside a sealed steel container. The result was a brutal shockwave reaching up to 30,000 pounds per square inches that surged through the interior, wiping out every electronic component and fragile circuit board within a 50-foot radius. Steel columns that had been designed to carry the roof couldn't withstand coordinated blasts from the inside. They warped like tin cans. The entire roof collapsed inward, burying more than 200 Atlant Aero UAVs in late-stage completion beneath tons of twisted metal and deformed concrete. Inside the control center, a chain of secondary blasts completely destroyed the server systems. Production data, logistics schedules, and critical schematics covering 3 months were wiped clean in less than a second. No time to recover, no time to back up, no time to even grasp what had just happened. And this was the heaviest consequence of the strike. The main drone swarm rendered the entire batch of UAVs Russia had just finished producing for combat utterly useless total dead weight. That, above all, was the most important strategic objective this attack was built to achieve. The Atlant Aero UAV factory, once a source of pride for Russia, is now nothing more than a pile of twisted scrap metal. Air raid sirens blared across Rostov-on-Don, but it was already too late. FSB agents flooded the scene in chaos, trying to contain a disaster that could no longer be hidden. A 1,000-foot column of black smoke rose at dawn like a tombstone for Russia's UAV ambitions. Initial reports showed that 70% of the production line had been destroyed, and 15 of Russia's top UAV engineers, along with several workers, were killed. By 6 a.m., satellite imagery confirmed the scale of the devastation. The site of the main assembly workshop was now a crater roughly 20 feet deep. This was not just a successful raid, it was a strategic knockout blow. Russia lost a key source of reconnaissance UAV supply for units in Rostov, forcing many forces to operate in near blindness. More importantly, the storage depot holding completed UAVs was wiped out, immediately slowing the pace of Russia's UAV strike waves. Ukraine hit the root of the problem. Instead of spending resources shooting down UAVs one by one in the sky, they destroyed the place where those UAVs were stored and prepared for launch. This was not just sabotage, it was a long-term strategy to weaken Russia's UAV capabilities. While Moscow was still in panic, unable to understand how it had been struck so deep inside its own territory, Ukraine used that 7 two-hour window of chaos to launch 5 more attacks in the Khark area. With a relatively small number of UAVs but an exceptionally sharp plan, they proved a core truth of modern warfare. Victory does not belong to the side with the biggest army, but to the side with the smarter strategy. Russia learned a bitter lesson. Never underestimate Ukraine's UAV forces. If you like this kind of analysis, hit like and subscribe to the channel. In your view, what was the biggest mistake by the Russian commander underestimating the decoys or relying too heavily on the new radar? Leave your thoughts in the comments.